Welcome to Highly Sensitive Money. This episode is a conversation with Franklin Taggart, coach and former musician, about his experiences with marketing, entrepreneurship, and managing burnout. We discuss the challenges of being a highly sensitive person in business and finding spiritual fulfillment through entrepreneurship. Franklin shares his journey from a multifaceted career in music and social services to coaching, emphasizing the importance of balancing income streams, managing financial challenges, and reevaluating traditional mindsets around money. Key insights include the importance of gradual career transitions, the impact of coaching on personal growth, and strategies for sustaining creative careers. Welcome to Highly Sensitive Money. I am your host, Diana Yanez, and I am really excited to have a mentor of mine, Franklin Taggart, here for today's interview.
Hey, Diana, it's nice to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
As a business owner, I'm always looking for different ways of doing marketing. And I first met Franklin through somebody else's work. I listened to an interview that he did with Danny Gardner, who wrote Quiet Marketing. And I loved Franklin's voice so much on his podcast, and also just the ease with which you weaved in so many different concepts that I immediately I think I spent a couple of hours listening to you that same day. And it was at a time when I was getting used to doing marketing in a way that didn't leave me feeling fried.
Yeah.
So that was really, really helpful.
You were also in the midst of your digital nomad experience, which has a lot of energetic demands of its own.
I was at the end of my digital nomad experience. I remember I was in Bogota. I had just moved to my second Airbnb that month. And I was feeling, I mean, again, newly getting comfortable with being highly sensitive. Now I look back and I'm like, no wonder I was so fried. The logistics of changing grocery stores every week was just too much.
Yeah, right. Well, that's just it. I think, the highly sensitive person, our energy is affected by everything. And I think we have to monitor it and guard it in ways that other people sometimes don't. And being in situations where you don't have the ability to stabilize for any length of time can be very taxing energetically. And
I don't know if you're familiar with high sensation seeking.
Mm-hmm. I've heard of it. I haven't done a lot of reading about it or understanding about it.
So I am also high sensation seeking, and it's a very contradictory combo. It means that I like novelty.
Oh, okay.
So I'm both in need of alone time and desperately want to meet new people at the same time. Which is what led me to be a digital nomad, which is what really had me love the experience. The first year, I was all about it.
Yeah.
The next 6 months, I was getting tired. And the last 6 months, I was incredibly burnt out. It just switched very quickly.
Yeah. Well, for all of us, I think that there's a balance that we have to draw, because as business owners, we do need to interact with people in some way, shape, or form. There's interaction involved. Now, there's some people that have learned how to navigate that through content channels and videos and podcasts very effectively, so that their actual real-time exposure to other people is minimal. But then there are others that really, like you've described, where we just I just need to be around other people. It's like I've been working all week, and I love working alone, and I need some interaction here, right? Yeah, I get that.
And you specifically work with people who love working alone, right?
Many of my clients are people who really, they identify as introverts, they identify as highly sensitive. Most of them identify as some kind of a creative, an artist, an author, designer, somebody who's really tapping into their creative muscles.
Yeah. And as an entrepreneur, as a new entrepreneur, I'm going into my third year, I've realized how much more I identify as a creative than I did when I worked in very traditional financial services, very traditional profit margin analysis. So it's been an expansion of who I am in many ways.
Yeah.
And it brings me to one of the reasons that I loved your work so much, Franklin, was when you talked about the spirituality of entrepreneurship, or how
Yeah.
possible it is for entrepreneurship to bring in spirituality. I'd love to hear your take on that.
Well, I think, you know, spirituality, in my experience, is it's a process of knowing yourself and the universe and whatever relationship there might be within you and the universe. And I think a big part of self-exploration is learning your strengths, your weaknesses, your limitations, your possibilities, all of those things. And that's a very spiritual quest, if you ask me. Most folks who would identify as being spiritual seekers or spiritual people very often are investigating their own development as a person, as a human being. And it very often leads to a circumstance where they're shown a bigger version of life as a result of that seeking. And I think entrepreneurship naturally it can lead people in that direction very easily. And it's interesting to me, so many people who started out as conventional entrepreneurs and business owners ultimately find themselves, meditating or learning about mindset or learning yoga or getting involved in some kind of self-development that has probably more of a spiritual origin than it does any other kind. And I find it interesting that people who are in entrepreneurship for a long time very often will have a very strong spiritual component of life in conjunction with that.
And I wonder if it's because as an entrepreneur, we are creating our own path.
Oh,
Unless
yeah.
you're like franchising off of someone else's idea, a lot of the times you don't know the path in front of you, especially in these early years. I have this hope, this wish that like in 10 years I'll know exactly what's happening at all times. But then I see your face and you're like, no, you won't. You'll
Well,
just get more used to being confused.
that hasn't been my experience, but if it happens to be your experience, Diana, you may become my mentor.
But just the freedom of being an entrepreneur, we end up getting to, at least for myself, vocation has always been very important.
Yeah.
Doing something where I was able to afford my life and also be of service to people around me.
Yeah.
And it was very triangulating, which I know was your experience too. I would love for you to share like how you got to your current role and where you were before.
Oh, my life has been a long series of what I call happy accidents and decent misfortune. My longest career path has been in music. And I retired from performing about 2 years ago now, about a year and a half, going on 2 years ago. And a big part of that was that I was just at a point with my music career where I knew that it had really reached an end for me. I still wanted to make music, but I didn't want to go out and do the performances and haul the sound system and set up the speakers and the microphones and all of that stuff. I was just done with that. But my life started with a desire to just be in music in any way that I could. And what that meant was that for many years I had a variety of side jobs. And I started my first businesses when I was in college. They were usually music related, like I had a recording company and I had a publishing company. And I had got a combined degree in both music and business because I knew that business was going to be an important part of whatever I did. But I also, for 7 or 8 years, I worked in social services, doing I was a group home counselor and a crisis intervention call specialist and a conflict resolution teacher and all of this stuff. So I just got all of this weird experience, this combination of experience that I don't know of anybody else who's had exactly the same set of things that I have. But I just kept adding all of these different components over time. And about 7 or 8 years into the social services part of my life, I realized that I was very burned out and had reached the end of that chapter of my life. And I had never really done music as a full-time occupation. So I had saved up some money, and I moved to Nashville and started learning about the music business firsthand. I lived in Nashville for almost 2 years, and I like to call that part of my life my graduate school experience. Even though I didn't get a master's degree, it was still that level of intensive learning firsthand, how the business works, all the different parts of it. And what I found is that the commercial music business in Nashville was not a real good fit for me. And that was kind of a source of despair, because that had been the life that I had dreamed about for a long time. But when I finally got to the end of that, I went to Washington, D.C. for a weekend at the invitation of a friend of mine that I had met online. This was the early days of AOL. And I met her on AOL. We, started a friendship there. And she invited me to come up to D.C. to see what was going on up there. And by and large, we discovered that D.C.'s music scene was a perfect fit for me. And I was offered a job at a music store. I was offered the opportunity to play guitar for a couple of other songwriters. The songwriting that was happening there was a lot more in line with the kind of writing that I was doing. And I found that there was a really cool folk scene all along the east coast of the U.S. And D.C. was right in the middle of it. So I just decided I'm going to go ahead and do music full time. I moved to D.C., and I lived there for about almost 14 years. And that was the first time in my life that I was able to do music full time, both performing, teaching music lessons, writing songs. I made my first and only CD during that time period. And then all of a sudden, in the midst of all of that, I was enjoying a pretty successful career track in music at that time. And then my body started to have some problems. The first thing that developed was I had a severe case of tendonitis in both of my arms, basically from my wrists all the way up to my shoulders. So playing the guitar was very painful. And I just could not perform for longer than just a few minutes without excruciating pain. And then about 2 years later, I started to have problems with my organs were starting to shut down, and nobody could figure out why. And so for about 2 years, I had to go through all of the different tests and things like that to find out that I have a thyroid condition called Graves' disease. But by the time they actually figured that out, I had gone into congestive heart failure and had been hospitalized 6 times. Now, the scary part of this, financially, was that I went through all of this and I didn't have health insurance in the U.S., which I don't know if you're familiar with it, but in the U.S., if you don't have health insurance and you do get sick, basically it's a formula for financial ruin, and that's exactly what happened. So during that time that I was sick and recovering, I had to find other ways to make money besides music. And so that was kind of the early stages of online courses and digital graphic design and digital freelancing and things like that. So I started to experiment. It was also the early days of podcasting. YouTube had just been around for just a couple of years at that point. So I just started experimenting. I started blogs. I started a podcast. I didn't do YouTube quite then, but I had two of the earliest online courses on beginning guitar and beginning home recording. They're embarrassingly still out there in the world, and I've gotten a lot better and a lot more knowledgeable since then, so don't go looking for them. But that turned around a time period for me where I had to really redefine what my career path was going to be. And it was during that time that people started to ask me to help them figure out how to do like creative businesses, like music or writing or design or anything like that. And what I realized a little while into that was that I was actually coaching. And I really found that I loved that as much or more as I did music, which was a real eye-opening experience. To find anything that paralleled music to me was really remarkable. So that was when coaching started for me.
So to find a bit of a second vocation once music was no longer possible in the same way.
The discovery that I made that I think is really important to me anyway, is that there's a distinction between gifts, talents, and skills. And very often I think we confuse our gifts and our talents. But our gift is something that's distinct from our talent, but our talent is still a way of delivering your gift into the world. So the way that I looked at it was that I had a musical talent, but the gifts that I had were things like encouragement, acceptance, vision, possibility. Those were the gifts that I had. And those came through my music just as much as they did my coaching or anything else that I did. A lot of the blogs that I had written during the time that I was experimenting with blogs had to do with inspiration and with letting people know how they could do something that was important to them, right? So the gift of encouragement, the gift of possibility, the gift of understanding, and the gift of all of that kind of stuff, they were all being delivered through music, but then they were being delivered through coaching too. And so what I understood from that experience was that the talent and the gift are distinct from each other, but your gift can be delivered through many talents, right? Your gift isn't limited to one talent. It can come through many conduits. It can come through many channels. So I was very encouraged by that, and I was energized by that. And as I started to recover my health again, coaching became equally important to me as music was.
So it was kind of like if you were dancing, you were handed from one perfect fit to another perfect fit that you didn't even know was out there.
Yeah, completely. It was very much like that.
Yeah. And as someone who's experienced your coaching, I remember one of the things that when I first reached out to you, I was in the middle of a burnout stage. I was in the middle of like, my business isn't really taking off the way that I want it to.
Yeah.
And I was also very exhausted from the lifestyle that I had at that time, because that lifestyle had run its course. And I remember your patience and your generosity as you were sitting with me during that.
Yeah.
And what really comes to mind is like, you can only take people as far as you've gone yourself.
It seems that way, yeah. I think so.
And you've gone very far in figuring out your vocation and being a creative person and being highly sensitive. So I appreciate having been able to receive your gifts.
Well, I'm grateful for that. And I'm delighted that you were able to receive something valuable. The thing that's really cool about gifts is that when a gift is activated and brought through, I am just as blessed by the exchange as the person who invokes that. It's like the person who calls that into the world through me gets something from it, but I get as much from it as they do. So it's an energizing and blessing experience for me too, right? Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things that I think is really kind of a critical thing to look for in what we do. And a lot of people talk about finding your passion and things like that. I'm suspicious of the passion part of it because it's not always a passionate thing, but it can be very energizing. And one of the ways that I feel in the midst of coaching is I feel more alive, alert, and awake. And it's like, yeah, that is a wonderful presence. That's a wonderful way to feel in the world, you know? So those are the kinds of hallmarks that I look for.
So it's a bit generative on both sides, like both the person receiving the coaching and you as the coach is being generative or like is having energy created.
Yep.
Whereas what I heard with the distinction with passion was that passion can sometimes be consuming, right? Where it's...
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's really interesting is that for me, passion was never a starting place. It was always a result.
That's so interesting because I would imagine a creative who moved into full-time earning a living through music. In my mind, the stereotype would be like you would be very passionate about it.
Yeah, I mean, I loved music and there was a passion aspect to it, but it wasn't a constant and it wasn't a starting place. It wasn't the thing that pushed me into it. It was just like, I think there were other things at work. Like for me, when I started playing guitar, I was 13 years old and I had begged for a guitar for a couple of years. I wanted one so badly because I knew that I wanted to do music. It was interesting to me endlessly. And it was something that I would do whether I had an instrument or not. But I remember begging for a guitar. And by that time, my parents had already sprung for piano lessons. They bought a trumpet. They had paid for trumpet lessons. And they were kind of burned out on buying me instruments that I was ultimately going to not want to do. But when I got a guitar, I think one of the things that was really wrapped up in that for me was that the guitar was a part of my identity. The guitar was a part of who I could be in a group of people, right? And as an introvert, that was an important thing because, you know, it was just as easy for me to just hang out in a quiet room somewhere with a book and not interact with anybody until like dinner time. And then it was usually pretty minimal interaction. And then I would go back in my room and read more. But when I got the guitar, it was a way of not only being by myself and exploring my own desires and curiosities, but it was a way for me to be public in a safe way and in a creative way and in a fun way, all of those things. But I didn't recognize passion as a part of that, other than that there was a high level of enjoyment in the activity a lot of the time. It wasn't, like I said, it wasn't constant, but whenever I was playing with a group of people or whenever I was playing a song, there was what I like to say is that I was fully present and fully absent at the same time. It was a flow experience. And that was
you took the word out of my mouth. I was thinking flow.
Yeah, that was the one place in my life where flow could happen. And I don't think that flow is necessarily a passionate experience. For me, passion was just as absent as I was, but there was a presence that happened that was transcendent and full and alive. Very similar to the presence that I feel in coaching.
Yeah. And now I'm gonna kind of do a hard turn to take us back to what your childhood was like with the music lessons and the instruments.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, what was the financial background of your childhood? And how do you see it weave through the different iterations that you've had of earning a living?
Well, I grew up in a family that's kind of a strange financial situation. My dad was a teacher, and when he got his first teaching job out of college, the salary was $2,200 a year. Yeah, and so he always had second jobs. He always had odd jobs. My mom stayed at home with kids for the first I don't know, the first 11 or probably 11 years of their being together. And then she started to take work outside of the home when I was about 11 or 12 years old. My youngest sister was almost 2, and my mom started working full time when my dad went back to school. He was originally going to law school, and then he ended up getting his PhD in education. So money was always tight when I was a kid. I remember one of the most vivid memories that I have from my childhood about money was that we had gone grocery shopping, and at the Safeway store in the little town where we lived, they had at the checkout counter, there were these little toys that were placed with the candy bars and stuff like that, the impulse buy section of the store. And there was one toy that really caught my attention. It was like a little kind of a Superman film strip. It was like one of those little things that you look into and then you see a Superman story, but it wasn't a Viewmaster or anything like that. But it was like a Superman story, and it was 89 cents. And I wanted that so badly. And my dad said, no, we can't afford that. And so at that point, I kind of internalized an idea that we were poor. And I remember even like a couple of weeks later, it was time for me to buy school supplies. And I remember telling my dad not to buy me any because we didn't have the money for it. And that I would use. How old
were you when that happened?
I was probably 7. I would guess 6 or 7 years old. And I just remember that being a very stark message that we don't have a lot of money, so we can't afford things that we want. We can only afford barely the things that we need, right? At the same time, I had a great aunt who lived in the same town that we did, who put the whole family to work. She owned a hotel, and she employed all of us. And I had my first job when I was like 5 and 6 years old, working for Aunt Lou. I would deliver the bank deposit and then go to the post office and pick up the mail for the hotel. And I remember that every time that I would do that, she would pay me a quarter, right? So I always had money in my pocket when I was a kid because Aunt Lou always had a job for me. And then when I was 7 years old, I learned there was a big mangling iron for sheets and pillowcases for the hotel. And she did all of her laundry. All of the sheets and pillowcases were done in one of those old washing machines where you had to actually take a stick, pull the thing out, and then put it through the rollers, and then do that over and over and over again. And then she would hang the sheets and pillowcases on the clothesline out in the yard. Now, this was in Wyoming, which sometimes was very cold. My job when I was 7 was to take the sheets and pillowcases off the clothesline, put them in a basket, take them downstairs into the basement of the hotel. And there was this big iron. It was probably 3 feet long, and it had a roller on it. And it was called a mangling iron. And we would mangle the sheets and the pillowcases so that they would be pressed, to put on the hotel beds. And I got paid $1 for every load of sheets and pillowcases that I took off the line and mangled. And it usually took me about an hour to do that. The big mangling iron was like, I don't know how a 7-year-old was allowed to do this because it was dangerous. I mean, this thing was hot. But you would run the sheets and the pillowcases through it. It was like just a big iron that you could use to do sheets and pillowcases fairly quickly. So I got paid $1 a load for that. I was always able to find work of some kind, either for Aunt Lou at the hotel, or I could always do yard work for people or shovel snow in the wintertime. There was always a way to make money. When I got to be around 11 or 12, I had my first paper route where I would deliver newspapers around the neighborhoods where I lived. And I had a morning and an afternoon route. So I always had money. But I kind of always had parallel to that message that we are poor going on at the same time. And I internalized that. to the point where even if I had money, I didn't feel like I had money. It was a real strange combination of things.
And did you have a say over how the money was used, or was it expected to go back into the household?
Well, it was my money, so I could use it the way that I wanted to. I remember in 7th grade, I worked all winter shoveling snow. And I mean, back then you would get $2 or $3, sometimes $5 for shoveling snow after a big snowstorm. And I remember at the end of that winter that I had enough money to buy a portable television for myself. And I had wanted one for a really long time. So I had $75 saved up, and I bought my own TV. And then I remember that one of my favorite things that I liked to do is I liked to buy Christmas presents for everybody. And so I would always buy my sisters like the latest and greatest Barbie thing or something like that. So I liked spending money. I liked it. And we had a little market right around the street, right around the corner from where we lived. And I used to go there and buy candy and have candy. I was the candy man at school. So it's like people would come to me for their gum and their candy and stuff like that. And I always had a pocket full of it. So yeah, I learned how to spend money as well as I learned how to make it. You know.
And that portable TV, did you save up for it, or did you just happen to have $75?
I saved up for it. I knew that I wanted it, and I saved up for it specifically.
So you learned all of the skills, how to make money, how to save it, how to give it.
Yep.
At a very, very, very young age.
Yep. But I've always had that conflict of being able to make money, being able to have money, and still feeling poor. Mm-hmm. There's always been that conflict going on. And, ultimately, I think at this point that message that we can't afford this has been on the decline in my life over the last, 8 or 9 years. But when I went through the illness and didn't have insurance, I had to file for bankruptcy. So that was the beginning of yet another cycle of figuring out how to generate income. I don't know that I fully financially recovered from that bankruptcy yet. And it's been 10 years now. But
no, and medical issues are the leading cause of bankruptcies in the U.S. I think 2/3 of bankruptcies are because of the lack of health insurance and the lack of a safety net that we have for that.
And it was really a fluke that I didn't have insurance at the time, because I had had insurance up to about a few months before that, and I was going to get on the insurance that my wife had, and I didn't get on her insurance in time. And they would have told me at that point that I had a pre-existing condition and I wouldn't be covered anyway. But, 6 hospitalizations and 1 major surgery later, I was close to $500,000 in the hole, and there's still about 200,000 of that that's outstanding that I still have to account for. And that's, that's 10 years in my past. Or more. I got sick 15 years ago.
So how, your financial background of, there was always a way to work, there were many things that you wanted that you couldn't have, and yet at the same time you did get to experience being generous as the kid with all the candy in the playground.
Yeah.
How did that affect your future career decisions? And I'm especially interested in when you decided to go full-time into music.
Okay. That's a good question. Anytime that you go into a creative field like music or art or writing or anything like that, there's a risk in those fields that I don't feel is as present in other areas. And I think part of it is that your success really depends on whether other people like what you do enough to pay you for it. And there's a lot of uncertainty around that. And it's like, if I go out and shovel snow, yeah, it's okay if somebody likes what I do, but the fact that I just did all of that work for them is what they're paying me for. When I go up and I perform on stage for an audience, there's a difference in what's being delivered there. And it's a life enrichment. It's something meaningful that people are exchanging. And it's not as tangible as if I go and shovel your walk for you. So it's really hard to understand, first of all, how much is that worth? And second of all, it's how much do I give away and how much do I ask for compensation for? And all of those kinds of things. And there's a complexity to creative careers, especially around the money aspect of it, that I have not seen in other career paths. Like I said, when I was working in the crisis center, it was easy for me to say, yeah, I'll do this for $30,000 a year, or I'll do this for however much, salary. And it was an easy transaction. As a musician, being able to get up on stage for a couple hours while people drink and talk while you're trying to perform, there's a lot of insecurity there. And I had to really learn, especially as a highly sensitive person, I had to learn how to weather that insecurity. And it was almost constant for the first couple of years that I was working. Now, the thing that I was really happy about was that I did have a job in a music store. It was a part-time job that didn't pay great, but it was still a job in a music store. And I was able to start teaching guitar lessons. I had never thought about that as a possibility for myself. And when I realized how much money I could make teaching guitar lessons, all of a sudden, I was able to actually make enough money to live on. Between performing and teaching, I could make a really nice middle-class living.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay, so those skills of like juggling multiple jobs as a kid, seeing your dad juggle multiple jobs.
Yeah.
Then when you were a performer, it was because you had multiple streams of income. And yeah, as an entrepreneur, I also have that. I have like a steady one that's always the same, and I have the ones that come and go, and I have like learning how to navigate having a cushion and how much to spend on investing in my business. And it's an interesting conversation. And you did bring that in as a highly sensitive person.
Yeah.
It took work at the beginning. What do you remember? I guess if you were to talk to somebody in that similar position, someone who's highly sensitive and is in their first few months after deciding to move away from a job, from a career that they're burnt out in, but that had steady income, and moving into something creative, what advice would you have for them?
Well, the first thing that I'll tell them is that I'm not a part of the school that says that you need to just jump in with both feet, because I feel like that's really a higher risk than most people are ready for. And the majority of people who do jump in with both feet end up experiencing a fairly high level of failure before there's any success, if there's any success at all. So one of the things that I usually recommend for people is to find ways to experiment with your desired direction first, and find ways to create revenue streams, maybe on a smaller scale at first, while you're transitioning out of the previous career. Now, this is especially hard if you're really burned out. But one of the things that some of my clients have found was that just giving themselves the permission to do that one little experiment was enough to help temper the burnout so that they could tolerate the time that they had left in their organization that they were leaving, right? Or the position that they were leaving. So what I usually recommend to people is, let's find ways to make this a gradual transition, and let's talk about what needs to be in place in order for you to make the full leap. What needs to be happening in order for you to feel comfortable saying, yes, this is what I do now. Mm-hmm. So a lot of times what that'll be is like, okay, what's the minimum amount of revenue that your new pursuit has to be generating for you to feel comfortable and confident leaving the old job behind? Now, very often, it doesn't have to be the same amount. Very often, if people can say, I just need to make sure that my basic costs are covered and that I have a little bit left over that I can put into savings, or invest in some way, that's going to be enough for me to say, okay, I can be full-time in this now, right? The other thing I like, I don't know if you're familiar with a marketing guy named Dean Jackson, but Dean has a really compelling idea, and that is that he set his situation up so that he created a whole bunch of passive revenue streams to the point that his basic living expenses, his basic life budget, is covered all by income that's residual. Another word for that is passive income. But he has it set up so that all of the books and courses and things like that that he's made pay enough to cover his living expenses, so that everything that he makes from anything else is gravy. I think that's a pretty cool thing.
No, that's a dream, right?
Right.
Passive income that covers your food and shelter expenses. That's often what I call them, like the bare minimum food, whatever that means to you.
Yeah. But what I really like about that, and I know that it took him years to get to the point where that was the reality, but just having that vision of saying, I want my residual income to cover the basics of life. And he lives a pretty extravagant lifestyle. He lives in a pretty large place in Florida, and he's got a second home in Canada and properties everywhere else, and he's pretty heavy duty in real estate. But the thing that I really like about that was just the vision of it, of saying, I want my residual income to pay the bare minimum so that everything else is just gravy. For an entrepreneur, I think that vision is an interesting one. So that's one that I've been trying to develop as I've been going over the last few years, is I'd like to have a handful of products that are available, that are evergreen products that are always in demand, and that I can make a predictable amount of income from. And then I don't have as much pressure on having to find a coaching client right now.
Right.
You know? Now, I don't mind finding coaching clients. I love the process of marketing and developing client relationships. I love that process. I love that process as much as almost as the coaching itself. Because in my approach, coaching sells coaching. So I give it away at the beginning because I want people to experience the power of it. And I get to experience the power of it in that exchange. So it's a powerful exchange for both of us. And often it leads to a commitment over a longer period of time for a significant investment. I love that. But I don't want to have to do that in order to have a business. You know what I mean?
When I first became an entrepreneur, I remember the second month, somebody who had offered to coach me my first 6 months for free, she found a position, the position that I have right now. And I remember at the time I didn't want it because I was an entrepreneur. I was going to make my own money. And I was visiting a cousin of mine who is a therapist. And she looked at me and she's like, do you know how long it takes to get clients? She's like, say yes to this part-time job. And in 6 months, if you're full of clients, then you can let this one go. But before we started recording, I was just sharing with Franklin that like now going into my third year, I have clients that heard of me 6 months ago, talked to me 3 months ago that are now signing on.
Yep.
It can take a while.
Yes.
And
indeed.
I know that I am also a slow buyer. And I think maybe many highly sensitive people are, we're just kind of like deciding, how do we want to go into this relationship?
Coaching is not an impulse buy. It's not an impulse buy for very many people, right? I've had a few people that have just bought, after a really very positive initial exchange that was kind of short, but they were probably at a point in their situation where they were just really ready, and it felt really good in the moment, and they said, well, where do we sign? Where do we go from here? I want to start now. That's an exception to the rule. For the majority of the time, the journey from becoming aware of somebody to actually working with them as a coach, there's generally months involved. Sometimes years. And it's okay to be that way. because you know what? It's a it's an intense relationship, and in my opinion, it's a really high level relationship commitment, on par with a relationship that you would have with a professional colleague or coworker or boss, or possibly even a family member. You know, it's that intense sometimes.
Yeah, yeah. And people have different buying cycles. I want to go back to something you had mentioned earlier when people are coming out of burnout and then
Yeah.
going into whatever new vocation or career they want to move into. You said that often people just like having some secondary income that's coming from the new idea will be enough to get them ready. And I also think it's the timeline, right?
Yeah.
Saying or having very clear guidelines of when I will make the switch, moving away from the idea if I make the switch to when
Yep.
can already be so helpful for dealing with burnout.
Well, that's an empowering mindset. It is. I mean, and that's the thing, is that mindset can be either limiting or empowering. There's not very much in between. The maybe mindset is a no mindset. So it's like, you're either empowering yourself or you're not. And that's all coming from the way that you think about what's going on. What I would look at very often, I know that burnout is an uncomfortable and sometimes painful and just not really a pleasant place to be. I've been there before. But very often, it's a guidance system that's telling you that you've reached the end of a chapter and you need a new one now, right? And if you don't pay attention to that, it's not going to get better. So I think that burnout very often is an internal sign that we really need a change to happen. And it's an urgency then for that change to take place. Now, the problem that very often accompanies that is that people get so desperate for a change that they don't take thoughtful steps. They just do something impulsive and crazy. Now, that gets them out of the burnout situation, but it might put them into a situation that's just as risky or precarious as the one that they've just left, and that ultimately they're gonna end up with another kind of difficulty. So what I look at is that don't let the burnout point get to the place where you're so desperate for change that you'll do anything. Because when you're willing to do anything, all of a sudden, that's when your boundaries fall to the floor and you'll do anything. And that anything can be detrimental to you.
Yeah, it's that saying out of the frying pan into the fire.
Yeah.
Part of it.
Yeah. And I've been in situations where I've done that before, where I left something that was fairly secure and just jumped into something that wasn't, without any kind of safety to support me. And I ended up regretting that. I mean, it certainly didn't set myself up for easy times. And so the one thing that I'll tell you, there have been many times throughout my entrepreneurial career, and a lot of times during my music career, where there was a side job and it was just okay to do that. Mm-hmm. It just allowed me to have both the kind of stability that I needed, so that I didn't have to put that pressure on my creativity to generate income. I think that kind of desperation isn't necessarily helpful for a creative person.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think there's something about when I have clients that are like, "Well, I don't really have a calling. I don't really have a vocation." The shadow side of for myself of having a calling of because I love the work that I do with money coaching. I love seeing people just relax and like build a system and see how they're going to make their dreams a reality or the potential for it. And yet it has really sometimes fed into workaholism because I love it so much and I'm spending all of my energy on it. I forget to spend my time in other areas of my life that are important. Next thing you know, I'm super out of balance and burned out by the thing that I love.
Yeah, and sometimes I think finding that balance is a pipe dream too, and sometimes I think it takes reaching that point where you're saying, "Oh, doggone, this isn't as fun as it used to be." Sometimes it takes getting to that point before you'll really pay attention and say, "You know what? I need to do something different. I need to make a different choice here. I need to go for a walk. I need to pet the dog
Right.
for a while. I need to step away from the screen for 5 minutes and, eat something decent." Right? It's just like, yeah, we're creatures of habit, and sometimes those habits are, to just do the thing that's interesting for every waking hour until you can't anymore.
Yeah, you
And
don't want burnout to be the only way you know that it's time to step back.
I was like that with the guitar when I first started. It was like I would pick up the guitar the minute that I got home from school, and I'd play until dinner time. I didn't do my homework. I was a horrible student in school, and I didn't like doing homework. But I could sit down and play the guitar for endless amounts of time. And I don't ever remember getting tired of that until I got to college, and I was working on some things that were pretty strenuous. And then I remember, I remember getting exhausted playing the guitar for the first time, and I thought, oh no, do I really love this?
So going back to money, one of the questions that I love asking people, and sometimes the answer is yes, sometimes the answer is no, but do you have a money mentor? And I think you kind of did go into it a little bit, or like someone whose relationship with money you aspire to have. You talked about this man who had a lot of passive income.
Yeah, Dean Jackson is one that I look at as somebody who just has really interesting ideas. There's another person, Dan Sullivan is a coach that I follow pretty closely in terms of his writing and a lot of the things that he's done with podcasts and interviews and things like that. And one of the things that Dan is really a champion of is the idea of that 10xing is easier than 2xing. So it's easier to envision a 10x income or a 10x plan than it is to envision a 2x plan. You think differently. And I like that because I feel like that in terms of revenue, there's a similar principle in effect. That if we really shoot high, that our vision adapts to match that. And if we're only shooting twice as high as we are right now, we don't have to think very differently to get there. And we don't organize our lives in a way to make that happen. Where if you think in terms of a 10x increase in revenue or a 10x increase in opportunity, then your behavior starts to adapt to make that happen. Our habits and our vision are really closely linked to each other. And very often our habits are linked to an old vision that fit us in a past circumstance, where our new visions need to come forward in order for new habits to develop.
The example that came to mind was like, if I make 5 pies out of my house and I figured out how to make 5 pies, I could probably figure out a way to make 10.
Yeah.
But 50? I need a completely different oven. I need completely different tools. I need to buy the ingredients differently. That's a really interesting idea about 10xing our revenue. Yeah.
You have a completely different recipe, because it's like you can't just do the same recipe 10 times over. The resources don't add up the same way when you scale what you're doing. So it's a whole different animal.
And at the beginning, you mentioned the we're poor mindset, and you also mentioned the medical debt that continues to be part of what you're carrying.
Yeah.
How do you bring those two together? How do you manage those?
Well, I think the hardest part for me was getting over the stigma of poverty and bankruptcy, and just really letting that go first, because I had a lot of shame that I wasn't able to cover those bases, the way that I should. And so readjusting my belief system around, what's acceptable behavior, that became very important. The other thing was, in addition to letting go of the shame that I had around that, I had to think differently about work, and I had to think differently about financial opportunities, and I had to think differently about other aspects of income and wealth creation. And that has been a learning journey. That has been a lot of fun. It's been rewarding, but it certainly wasn't short. There have been some lessons along the way that I wish that I could have avoided, but there are certain things that I wish that I would have done differently. The very first one being that I wish that I wouldn't have gone without insurance. I regret letting that lapse, thinking that I was going to be okay because I was a healthy guy in his mid-40s.
And we've all done it. We've all done it. When I have clients that are going on to entrepreneurship, we talk about the insurance. I honestly, in Mexico, I can self-insure.
Yep.
I can't self-insure in the U.S. It's a very, very, very different system.
Different all the way around, right? And if I would have lived 12 hours north of where I was living at the time, my healthcare would have been paid for through the tax system. And I wouldn't have had any bankruptcy. I wouldn't have had any financial repercussions that took the rest of my life to resolve, right?
Well, and then also at the other side of that, if you're thinking of 10xing revenue, then sometimes financial constraints or financial debt can be a motivator.
One of the ways to 10x your revenue is to reduce your debt.
That's true, because you're not servicing debt.
Yeah. So when you double up on your credit card payments, you're actually increasing your revenue.
You mentioned that you feel like you're outgrowing that message that you heard when you were 6 or 7 around "we are poor," and that in the past few years, the past 7 or 8 years, that's been shifting. Mm-hmm. What has been the most helpful, or how did you see that shift start to happen?
Well, there were 2 or 3 patterns that I really had to grow up and look at as an adult. And one of them is that I had this really ingrained pattern of magical thinking about money, where I just always had this kind of, and I think part of it comes from that I had that aunt when I was a kid who had the hotel, who I could always turn to if I needed anything. I mean, if I needed anything for anything, I could just go to Aunt Lou and say, "Aunt Lou, I'd like to buy this. Can you help me out with that?" And she would have the money to do it. And that was always kind of a cushion when I was a kid. As an adult, I had some magical thinking that it was just always going to come from somewhere. Now, there are spiritual principles that suggest that that's the case, but there were a lot of times in my life when that didn't happen. And so I would find myself in a real desperate place. And desperation is never a good foundation to work from, because you make really bad decisions when you're desperate. So I had to really look at that magical thinking and really look at, am I waiting on a God or a universe or a Santa Claus to come in and be responsible for this thing? Or is this something that I really need to be more directly responsible for?
And that's can be really hard. I know that I get to have those conversations with clients about I keep pushing, how is this going to happen? How are you going to do it? Yeah. And there is that also that spiritual part of me that's sometimes you just have to leap and the net will appear. And yet it's a navigating, it's holding the paradox of like, what if it doesn't? And at the same time allowing, like inviting ourselves to dream big.
Yeah. That was one of the things that I really had to look at, was that magical thinking thread was a pretty strong one for me. Most of the time it led to a place of real uncertainty and discomfort and desperation. So when I started to address that and change it, that made a huge difference. Now, I still have a very spiritual outlook on work and money and compensation and reciprocity and generosity. I believe that those are spiritual principles, yes, but it's different from, I think that there's a responsibility that goes along with that is just as much of a principle that we need to honor, right? So the other thing that I really had to look at was I had to look at spending habits. I had a tendency to have boom and bust cycles where I would make a lot of money and then I would spend all of it. And I didn't have any discipline around how that was going to be spread out over time or anything like that. I had to learn how to do that differently. I also had to I had to look at my work cycle, and this has been probably the biggest challenge overall, is being able to keep both the delivery plate spinning and the marketing plate spinning at the same time. So that when this delivery period is over, I've done the marketing so that there's no gap in between. Now, every business has cycles. I'm sure that you've started to realize that with your own. There are times of the year when your busyness is higher and your delivery cycle is higher. And there are times of the year when it's naturally lower. And there's just a kind of a pattern. And the longer that you do it, you're going to notice that, oh yeah, or, from November 15th until January 1st, nothing happens. All right. So that's going to be a really good time for me to do some of those other things that I need to do administratively and creatively and maybe marketing wise, so that when January comes around, that cycle will pick up again and I can work with it. But one of the things that I think we need to learn how to look at is how to look at those business cycles and how they affect our cash flow. That has been one of the trickiest things to learn, because it does take some time, longevity in your business, to be able to see what the natural pattern is, and then to be able to work with it and to be able to plan for it and to be able to make adjustments as you need to.
And when you're in the middle of all of it, when you're delivering services, when you're getting new clients, when you're doing all of it, it can be hard to step back. That's where coaching is so helpful. I know when I receive coaching, when I give coaching, it's creating that time away from all of it to see things more clearly, to get asked those questions of what cycles do you see. And yeah, I definitely see it in my workshops. April is financial literacy month. October is financial planning month. Those are the months that I'm busiest with workshops because of the nature of the month.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
So you're starting to see it already, right? And you're starting to plan accordingly, and that's what every business owner has to do.
Well, thank you so much for opening up around money. It's such a taboo subject to talk about. I really appreciate your openness, your honesty, and also sharing your vocation story. Like I've said multiple times during this podcast, during this conversation, it was really helpful to receive your coaching when I was coming out of that burnout stage.
Yeah.
For anyone out there who's looking to speak to Franklin, you're still offering coaching sessions, right?
I do a free 1-hour coaching session called Your Best Next Step Call. And it's easy to find when you go to my website, franklintaggart.com. There's a picture right at the top left of the page that says, schedule your best next step call here. And click on that picture and it'll take you right to the schedule. So people are welcome to take advantage of that. And again, I don't do a sales pitch during the call. That's not what it's for. It's strictly a coaching session. And it's fun and it's enlightening, and it's it's a great way for us to get to know each other. So let's do it. The book that I've read, and this is especially true for people who would consider their entrepreneurial path a spiritual one. A book that I've read in the last few years, it was recommended by a good friend of mine, is called It's Not Your Money, and it's by a woman named Tosha Silver. If you are someone who considers yourself a spiritual seeking entrepreneur, I think that you will find that book really resonant, and I recommend it wholeheartedly.
Okay, well, I will definitely add it to my reading list. Thank you.
Yeah,
You also mentioned that you're working on courses.
I am. My goal this year is to finish several of the courses that I've started in years past. And the one that I'm working on right now is a DIY video production course for coaches and consultants. This is specifically for coaches and consultants who have wanted to start in the video realm, but they don't have the money to hire a professional videographer, and they're a little bit nervous about the technology and about the process, and they're at the very beginning stage of it. This course will help you get started, and it will help you to make really good quality videos right out of the box. So if you're a coach or a consultant and you want to start getting into the video realm in an easy and delightful way, this course is for you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank
Yeah.
you. Once again, thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure to have this conversation.
Well, Diana, you're a light in the world, and I'll spend time with you anytime you ask.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode in the second season of Highly Sensitive Money, where we talk about money, social justice, and how to do this well as a highly sensitive person. To learn more about my services, check out my website, allthecolors.net, where you can also find a really fun link to a quiz on money archetypes, because understanding our own patterns with money makes it much easier to make changes and get to where we want to go. If you enjoyed today's episode, please rate and review wherever it is that you listen to podcasts. Thanks for listening.